All right. Hopefully everything is going well here tonight. Donna is down, or up, I guess it would be, in the Bellevue area, helping our younger son pack for the last couple of days before his trip to Texas. So he's bought a house down there and moving soon. And I therefore do not have my beloved wife to tell me if this thing's working or not. So I think I'm live. And if not, I'll have to re-record the whole thing here a little bit. That being said, we got a lot to do tonight with Revelation chapter 8. It's one of my favorite chapters. This is the night I'm going to introduce you to a biography on Josephus. And then we'll have quite a few quotes from him tonight as our hostile witness, as I've been calling him, testifying as one who never came to Christ, but as a Pharisee and as a priest and a first century eyewitness to these events, that even though he himself never understood the wisdom of our Lord, he was used to testify that all things that Jesus had prophesied, all things that had been prophesied prior to his coming to this earth in the Old Testament, and certainly all things prophesied here in the book of Revelation did in fact come to pass. We have fulfilled prophecy like none other in all of the Bible. So let's race on through. We have our, let's see, I got to get this going. It looks like I didn't quite catch everything here. So there we go. Chapters 5 through 11 begin the bulk of the book, and certainly with the opening of the 7 seals, we are about to have the message of the scroll that is underneath these seals revealed for all the world. So it gets exciting tonight as we get to that 7th seal and begin to read what actually no one other than Jesus was qualified to both, I think, read and reveal, but also to make come to pass. He is the chief actor and the one who is revealed in this wonderful book. So we have these 7 seals being opened. You saw this chart last week. Chapters 6 through 11 are all about the opening of those 7 seals, and particularly the bulk of them will be in the latter chapters of that grouping, since chapter 6 opens 6 of the seals in very rapid succession, but the 7th one that'll tell us what's in the book itself, allow us to look into that book, is not opened in that first chapter as Jesus opens these seals. But the 4 horsemen do not seem to ride. They appear, they're present, they're ready to do their work. The slain saints, however, who are crying out for vengeance under the altar in the 5th seal, are told to wait a little while longer. So we are informed that there's going to be a passage of yet some more time. And we learned then in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 last week, I mentioned it at the start of the week before, the 4 winds of 7, 1 through 3 are held back until the 144,000 bondservants are sealed. So several different ways, 4 of them I suggested a couple of weeks ago. We see with the revealing, or opening rather, the first 6 seals, that everything is being set in order. All of the players are being prepared. They are readying themselves for that last seal's opening so that their work can be done. Chapter 6 opens up 6 seals. Chapter 7 we studied last week gives us the sealing of the 144,000. I should have put it onto this chart as well, but also the presence of this great multitude of Gentiles who have come through the great tribulation. So as this little while that the slain saints must wait to come to pass till the last will join their number of martyrs murdered for the cause of Christ, this sealing of those individuals and of those individuals that are coming to Christ, and then the recognition of the Gentile Christians as well, the 144,000 clearly being Jews as opposed to the great multitude, has taken place. And now the 7th seal is open. Chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 give us 7 trumpeting angels who are immediately revealed once the 7th seal is open. So in chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, where it says, when he broke the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. I believe that it is during these 30 minutes, odd as it is, in a timeless place of eternity before the throne of God, yet John has a sense of earthly time. 30 minutes pass. In previous classes, I've had a lot of fun when I'm standing before a live audience, and I'll carefully and surreptitiously peek down at my watch while I remain silent for a mere 30 seconds. And it's just a ton of fun because it only takes about 6 or 7 seconds and the room starts to get nervous. People start looking up. They get their attention fully focused on me. They start fidgeting a little bit, and now we're ticking off 10 and 15 and 20 and 30, and all we're talking about is seconds, not minutes. And they begin to wonder if there's something wrong with me. And certainly in the room, there is rapt attention. What is going on? It is so unnatural to not have speech, or even after the many times that we are told the various people revealed or individuals that are revealed before and around the throne of God speak with loud voices. We have thunder, lightning, fire, and smoke, just so much noise and visual overload that's taking place. And then 30 minutes, total silence. And I believe what we have here, brethren, is that now the Lamb of chapter 5, who has been authorized because he has been qualified and he is worthy to open that scroll, is about to open that scroll. So we have the last 30 minutes before the book of Revelation now tells us what's inside that scroll. Silence for 30 minutes, and during those 30 minutes, I think what you find in verses 3 through 6 is the preparation for the answering of the fifth seal's prayers of the martyred saints. Let's read 3 through 6. Another angel came and stood at the altar holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. The angel took the censer and he filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. There followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. Well, brethren, I've just put up on the screen the fifth seal. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar, which we were told is there before the throne of God, underneath that altar, the souls of those who had been killed because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who live on the earth? And a white robe is given to each of them. They were told they were to rest for a little while longer until their fellow servants and their brothers who were to be killed even as they had been was completed also. In these verses now, chapter 8, verses 3 through 6, that prayer is directly answered. An angel came, stood at the altar. He had a golden censer. Much incense was given to him. It was added to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar, which was before the throne. So apparently above their heads, now he adds incense, apparently intercession, given to him that he might add it to the prayers of the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense ascended from the angel's hand with the prayers of the saints before God. They want vengeance, these early martyrs, for their suffering and their death. The angel took the censer, filled it with the fire of the altar, so now it couldn't possibly be more closely associated with the prayers of the saints on that altar. Ascended from the angel's hand with the prayers of the saints before God. He took the censer, filled it with the fire of the altar, hurled it to the earth, and there were peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. It's just cataclysm that now is unleashed. And it seems to me just unavoidably, the only conclusion that we can draw is that the little while has expired. In the vision, the time has passed and the last of the first century martyrs has died. There is waiting no longer. And in chapter 8 and verse 7, then the first sounded. The first of the 7 trumpeting angels, which we'll be hearing about all the way through chapter 11 to conclude the first half of this book, is the unleashing of the message and the punishment, the requested vengeance in the scroll that only Jesus can bring to pass. The first angel sounded, and there was hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So what does this represent? Obviously, a great deal of specificity here. It is a sign, it is a symbol, it is a figurative representation of some literal, actual, physical, material, space-time continuum actions that will take place upon the earth in answer to the prayer for vengeance. And we have, I think, conclusively proven, demonstrated from numerous places in the Old Testament and from many, many places in the New Testament as well, in very lengthy passages in both the Old and New Testament, that Old and New Testament is prophesying that only one city can be guilty for all the blood of the apostles and prophets, all the blood of the saints. That city is named. We are told what generation it's going to be in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, which we studied in, 19 or more lessons to prepare for this chapter, to prepare for the following chapters here in the book of Revelation. All of those prophecies are now soon to come to pass. They are a part of the scroll now open to be executed by Jesus upon those who killed these saints. So we have hail and fire mixed with blood hurled to the earth. We've talked about that word gas. We've seen how it's better translated land and often is. Land of Israel, land of Naphtali, tribal lands in the land of Israel is the way that's used in the Bible, that word. So it's not a third of the planet that's burned up. It's a third of the land of Israel that's burned up. Green grass, etc., the trees that this symbol represents. Now, when we get into Josephus here in just a minute, I think we will see such extreme similarity as to force upon me and then be confirmed year after year after year as I get deeper and deeper into Revelation and into the wars of the Jews particularly, though Josephus' other book, Antiquities, helps somewhat too. Wrote 4 books, but there's 2 that matter to us here. We see in the prophetic imagery of Revelation direct and correspondingly similar physical actions that took place. Galilee is about 1/3 of Israel. It is the northern third of Israel. It is the area into which Vespasian, the general, after the failure of Cestius Gallus earlier, which allowed time for the saints to obey Jesus and flee the city of Jerusalem, it is now the coming of the Great War. Cestius foolishly failed when he could have taken Jerusalem. Now he cannot. Vespasian then is replacing Cestius under the orders of Nero, the famous and despicable Nero. And Vespasian now comes in from the north. Vespasian arrives with massive numbers of troops. He arrives with every kind of military ordnance of the time. He comes then with huge force beyond that of the earlier Cestius Gallus. And he comes into Galilee and begins 3.5 years of warfare there in Galilee. So what I'd like to do tonight is first read, with regard to verse 7, a combined biography, which I got from Steve Mason's excellent book in 2002, entitled Josephus and the New Testament. Don't know Steve, haven't met Steve, have no idea what his church affiliation is, etc., but he's written just a great book called Josephus and the New Testament. And then online from the article, Is Josephus Reliable?, at Answers in Genesis. website I think many of you know, Ken Ham's website. He, the famous one who built a life-size ark, Kentucky, I think it is, Ohio, maybe Kentucky, I think. I've been in that ark, by the way, and it's well worth the trip. You do that if you can. But from his website is Josephus Reliable by Brenton Cook on January 1st of 2013. I've taken these two articles, greatly condensed them, and then woven them together, into a flowing narrative that's using back and forth quotations from both of these men. We're going to do a lot of reading tonight from Josephus, but let's try to understand something about the man beyond the bits and pieces I've mentioned about him earlier. So using these two men, we have this. Every scholar understands the importance of Josephus for the serious study of the New Testament. He was born in 37 AD, just a few years after Jesus' death, and very soon after Paul's conversion to Christianity. The son of a priest, he grew up in Jerusalem. As a teenager, Josephus spent time with various Jewish sects, knew them well, and was intimately acquainted with the religion of Israel, its temple and its feasts. He became a Pharisee, and his works provide insight into the inner workings of the first century Jewish sects. That's word so hard to pronounce for obvious reasons, S-E-C-T-S, sects, and such as the Pharisees and Sadducees. His description of another sect, the Essenes, helped confirm that they were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He also provides gripping details about other first century events, such as the destruction of the temple prophesied by Christ in Matthew 24, and the Jews' last-ditch resistance atop Masada. He knew a lot about the important background figures in the Gospels, King Herod and his sons, Roman governors such as Pontius Pilate, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was a priest himself, having lived for a time in Jesus' home region of Galilee. He knew intimately its geographical and social conditions. Josephus was reaching maturity at about the time that the Apostle Paul was imprisoned and sent to Rome. He later observed the Jewish revolt from the front lines, a military commander in the Jewish resistance and an eyewitness to Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. When he was captured, he got to see the other side, that is the Roman side as well as the Jewish side. In fact, to continue with the quoting, he won the favor of the general Vespasian, ultimately switched sides and received Roman citizenship, even adopting Vespasian's imperial family name, Flavius. He now had access to the emperor's libraries, military reports, and court records from Herod and the other rulers in Palestine, my parenthesis, not to mention all that was said and done during the times and half a time of the Roman invasion and eventual siege and destruction of Jerusalem. Quoting again, this means that when Josephus undertook his literary career in Rome from about AD 70 to AD 100, he was an exact contemporary of the gospel writers. Josephus's works offer us a potential goldmine for understanding the world of the New Testament. They are a resource whose value for New Testament study is not even remotely paralleled in another contemporary author. If his writings had not survived, Bible dictionaries would all be pocketbook size, and textbooks on the background of the New Testament would have little to tell us. Josephus has been the archaeologist's constant companion, suggesting where to look and how to interpret what is found. In fact, he provides the most important extra-biblical information on many key political figures, such as Herod the Great, Felix, and Pilate. For instance, most of our knowledge of Herod's extensive building projects, such as the temple that Christ often visited, comes from Josephus. Although everyone realizes the value of his writings, not many are able to sit down and read through them with profit, in spite of the fact that his collected works continue to sell in the tens of thousands every year. They mainly gather dust on the shelves of the ministers, rabbis, seminarians, and interested lay people who purchase them. So you may have noticed by now, I've just been working so hard that not happened to you. I was baptized into Christ on February 11th of 1973. Josephus was a whole lot more popular back then than he is now. He was much more familiar to the saints of the 70s than he is now. I count it a disastrous shame that so many Christians could pass through their lives in these more recent decades, not even know his name, let alone have ever read, a passage from his book. And he is the toweringly most important, outside of the Bible, living eyewitness recorder, historian in history. There's nobody that sheds more light on the New Testament, outside the New Testament, of course in the Old, than this man. And brethren, if we're going to be, genuinely serious about our Bible studies, then Josephus is the number one, unparalleled, peerless, guy that you go to. Well, let's start getting into him. So now, I will continue the reading. The reasons for this neglect of Josephus are clear enough. First, his writings are extensive, somewhat longer than the Old Testament, and more than 4 times the size of the New Testament. Second, they often seem to ramble endlessly. Third, the most popular English text of Josephus today was translated in 1737. That's before there was a United States of America, and by William Whiston. Although Whiston's translation and accompanying essays were a tremendous achievement in the early 18th century, today's reader gets the feeling that they are themselves period pieces from the remote past. The result is that Josephus's works often suffer the same fate as the King James Version of the Bible, a perennial bestseller, much loved, occasionally quoted, but hardly ever read. And brethren, don't let that happen to you. Continuing the quotes. Professional analysts of Josephus are aware of these problems, and in the past few years, some have reissued portions of his works in attractive formats that include scholarly commentaries, such as the Penguin edition of the Jewish War, translated by G.A. Williamson in 1981, and the beautifully illustrated edition by Galia Kornfeld and others in 1982, and quote, added by Larry, which I've been so heavily endorsing and promoting and advertising. Get a copy of that book. Ending the last paragraph of the quotations now. Like other historians of his day, Josephus sometimes invented heroic speeches and put them into the mouths of his subjects, such as the patriotic oratory of Eleazar, the leader of the Jews atop Masada. Since the men who heard Eleazar were slain in the siege, and since Josephus wrote the account from Rome, he cannot possibly have had access to the full speech. Few ancient historians were careful about numbers and statistics either. Scholars know that Josephus often errs on the chronologies of first century events with which he was quite familiar. So be wary of any numbers he gives. In summary, Josephus is an eminently important and helpful source for gathering details about the New Testament. And he'll be our primary source throughout all the rest of the book of Revelation, and particularly here tonight. So what about Josephus? He's a Jew, born in 37 AD. He is a Pharisee. He's the son of a priest, and he became a priest himself. He performed the duties that we read about in the Old Testament and in the New. He fought as a general for the Jews against the Romans. And his stories about Jotapata and Gamla, or sometimes read as Gamala, where I've been a couple of times, and you can see life-size replicas of some of the siege engines that were used in that occasion before Vespasian even began the last of the assaults on Jerusalem itself. This Galilean region is where Josephus functioned as the general for the Jews and was defeated, defected, joined the Romans, adopted family in Vespasian himself. But while I see him, as all scholars do, as an extremely trustworthy source, at the same time, he's kind of flaky sometimes. He seems to inflate numbers. And so people really wrestle with, how accurate is Josephus? And brethren, I'd suggest that he's highly accurate, seeing that he was an eyewitness from among the Jews, but he was commissioned and paid nicely by the Romans, and especially directly and personally in the household he lived of Vespasian, the general that was responsible for the fall of Jerusalem. He has to be analyzed first and foremost, not by the scholars of our day, but risking his own neck, the Jewish brethren that he lived among, and the Romans that he served under. His writings can't be too far off because they're being, edited by the two principal parties that are involved in this. So here's what I would suggest when it comes to chapter 8 and verse 7. We have the prayers asking of the saints asking for vengeance on the only possible city that vengeance can be wrought upon. Jerusalem, according to all the Old Testament and New Testament prophets. And now, the first of the trumpeting angels sounds. After Cestius Gallus' failure, the seven seals are unfolded. The rebellion's been going on for some time. And now the scroll is open for Jesus to wreak havoc on Jerusalem in answer to those prayers, as he prophesied and said he would. He's coming to do that. And the first thing we get is fire and hail mixed with blood thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth burned up, a third of the trees burned up, and all the green grass burned up. So let me read, as you can see the notations here, from Book 3, Chapter 4, paragraphs 1 and 2, and then from Book 3, Chapter 7, paragraph 9. I'll just read right through that amount of material, about half as much of what I just read on the bio. 3:4:1. The auxiliaries which were sent to assist the people of Sepphoris, or in Galilee, being 1,000 horsemen, 6,000 footmen, under Placidus the tribune, pitched their camp in two bodies in the great plain. The foot were put into the city to be guard to it, but the horse lodged abroad in the camp. These last, by marching continually one way or another and overrunning the parts of the adjoining country, were very troublesome to Josephus and his men. They also plundered all the places that were out of the city's liberty and intercepted such as durst, 1737 translation from William Whiston, go abroad. On this account it was that Josephus marched against the city, as hoping to take what he had lately encompassed with so strong a wall, before they revolted from the rest of the Galileans, that the Romans would have much ado to take it, by which means he proved too weak and failed of his hopes, both as to the forcing the place and as to his prevailing with the people of Sepphoris to deliver it up to him. By this means he provoked the Romans to treat the country according to the law of war. Nor did the Romans, out of the anger they bore at this attempt, leave off, either by night or by day, burning the places in the plain, and stealing away the cattle that were in the country, and killing whatsoever appeared capable of fighting perpetually, and leading the weaker people as slaves into captivity, so that Galilee was all over filled with fire and blood. Nor was it exempted from any kind of misery or calamity, for the only refuge they had was this, that when they were pursued, they could retire to the cities which had walls built for them by Josephus. That's the end of 341 in wars. We have fire and blood, every kind of misery. We have the very things foretold, Old Testament, New Testament, and Revelation thus far. Here's Wars 3, 4, 2. But as to Titus, now it's Vespasian's son, he had sailed over from Achaia to Alexandria sooner than the winter season did usually permit. So he took with him those forces he was sent for. And marching with great expedition, he came suddenly to Ptolemais. We're in the north. It's getting ready to come on down, and trouble even further, Galilean area. So he took with him those forces he was sent for, and marching with great expedition, he came suddenly to Ptolemais. And there, finding his father, together with the 2 legions, the 5th and the 10th, which were the most eminent legions of all, he joined them to the 15th legion, which was with his father. 18 cohorts followed these legions. There came also 5 cohorts from Caesarea, with 1 troop of horsemen and 5 other troops of horsemen from Syria. Now these 10 cohorts had severally 1,000 footmen, but the other 13 cohorts had no more than 600 footmen apiece, with 120 horsemen. There was also a considerable number of auxiliaries got together that came from the kings Antiochus and Agrippa. That's the second of Paul's interactions. And Soemus, each of them contributing 1,000 footmen that were archers and 1,000 horsemen. Malchus also, the king of Arabia, sent 1,000 horsemen, besides 5,000 footmen, the greatest part of which were archers. So that the whole army, including the auxiliaries sent by the kings, as well as the horsemen and footmen, when all were united together, amounted to 60,000, besides the servants, who, as they followed in vast numbers, because they had been trained up in war with the rest, ought not to be distinguished from the fighting men. For as they were in their master's service in times of peace, so did they undergo the like dangers with them in times of war, insomuch that they were inferior to none, either in skill or in strength. They were subject to their masters. Here comes 379, very short. Vespasian then sent the engines for throwing stones and darts around about the city of Jotapata. The number of the engines was in all 160. At the same time, other engines threw lances upon them with great noise, and stones of the weight of a talent, which all translates about 47 pounds, were thrown by the engines that were prepared for that purpose. That's 3 different kinds of stuff-throwing engines that were just mentioned. And then it says, thrown by the engines that were prepared for that purpose, together with fire and a vast multitude of arrows of the Arabian archers, as well as all those also that threw darts and slung stones. Brethren, the air was filled with fire. And Josephus, in other more gruesome places, discusses what a 47-pound rock will do to the human head and the rest of its body when it makes its impact. What it does is it fills the air with blood and fire. Well, what did I just read? There came hail and fire mixed with blood thrown to the earth, and 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. And then you go and you read Josephus, and it's a symbolic representation in Revelation of a very real thing that took place, fulfilling the time especially foretold in the prophets, as well as the very events themselves. So have a look at this, and I think I will go full screen here for just a minute for you. These are various models that have been made in a number of different Bible encyclopedias that I've bought and I took photocopies of. Here is a reconstruction of a catapult. I'm just reading. The smaller siege engine that threw heavy arrows was called catapulta, the larger one ballista. They operated in the same way as the later crossbow.
The pair of vertical coil chambers was at the front, the bow being drawn back by a windlass to the required limit of tension. The bow was released by a trigger, and the bolt shot along a trough through an aperture in the front. Here are some of the actual long Roman arrowheads fired by a catapult during these years of the Roman siege. And here is the larger catapult. The largest catapults were the onagri, named after the wild ass because of its kick. They threw stones of such enormous weight that they not only crushed men and horses, but broke enemy machines. When used in siege works, they could make holes in the walls. And when used by the defenders, they could smash siege towers and wooden machines. They could be very effective against the massed ranks of attackers. Here's a photograph I took a few years back here on top of Masada. These are the actual stones that were hurled by the same Roman soldiers in 73 after the fall of Jerusalem, when the last holdout of the Jews was on top of this Masada. There's the Dead Sea that you see in the background. Well, brethren, those things, when they've come, several hundred yards through the air, will blow your body to bits. Now, this isn't directly related to the passage we were just talking about, but so you can see it, the battering rams that will be employed at various places. Masada was one, but certainly at Jerusalem as well. And the battering rams in sieges is described by Josephus in Wars 3. They're using a different reference, 2:14 through 2:18. Its effectiveness and mechanism are verified by Marcus Vitruvius, the famous Roman engineer of the 1st century BC. That's on the left. On the right, the siege towers pulled close to the besieged walls were manned by archers and by soldiers operating the battering rams. The besiegers near the walls were protected by huts or covered with hides that reflected the arrows or boiling oil that was poured from the battlements. So here's a picture of those coverings. The wheeled siege platforms were covered with ox hides for the protection of the men stationed in the machine to batter the wall. So now, what do I think is going on here? Brethren, the similarity is very impressive. It is so impressive that to ignore that similarity, or even to go so far as to deny that similarity, and try to proclaim that the prophecy has no literal physical fulfillment, it's just about, general things to impress you, that good will conquer evil, for instance, so popular among us. Brethren, why should we be afraid of an actual fulfilled prophecy? Why should we fear that it actually takes place in the time frame, a little while, that was told by the prophet? Since when should we be squeamish about looking at prophecies in our Bible and then reading about their historical fulfillment in history? And so I'm getting more and more frustrated. I've been doing this for 33 years, and this is my 9th time to teach Revelation in those years. I get really fed up even with my brethren who seem so afraid of a fulfilled prophecy that they resort to these nebulous things that just hardly mean anything, instead of just seeing that the prophet meant what he said, and while he uses symbology, it still has a fulfillment in reality. And when you see the similarity between the two in the sign of Revelation and the reality of Josephus' eyewitness accounts, isn't it just time to say, hey, this represents that? Here's Revelation 8, verses 8 and 9 now. The second of these 7 angels sounds his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was hurled into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now, brethren, it wasn't a great mountain, so I don't have to think in real terms of a great mountain fulfilling this. It was something like a great mountain burning with fire was hurled into the sea. Well, what could that represent? It could represent the thrashing and upheaval of waters. It could represent a mountain burning with fire, since mountains do represent nations, a nation coming with fire to do some kind of harm to or upon or involving the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Well, here we go again. What do these two verses represent? Before I get into Josephus again, pardon me. All right, here are more excerpts that I believe directly represent the fulfillment of the prophecy given by Jesus to John. Here's Josephus from Wars of the Jews. We're in book 3 this time, and chapter 9 and paragraph 3. And I want to emphasize these are excerpts. Please buy Gaia Kornfeld's copy. Read the fullness of it. These things, brethren, go on for pages and pages and pages and chapters as Josephus discusses the certainly most impressive event of his entire life and what he spent much of the rest of his life just writing about under the patronage of Flavius Josephus, so that he took Flavius Vespasian, so that Josephus even took his name. That's a pretty close alliance. And here's Josephus in Wars of the Jews talking about things that he saw in book 3, chapter 9, paragraph 3, up in that third of Israel that is Galilee. Excuse me, this will be the central part in Joppa now. Joppa is not naturally an haven, for it ends in a rough shore where all the rest of it is straight, but the two ends bend towards each other. But the north wind opposes and beats upon the shore and dashes mighty waves against the rocks which receive them, and renders the haven more dangerous than the country they had deserted. Now, as these people of Joppa were floating about in this sea, that's the Jews, in the morning there fell a violent wind upon them. Maybe something like a mountain stirring up the sea. It is called by those that sail there the black north wind. And there dashed their ships one against another, and dashed some of them against the rocks, and carried many of them by force, while they strove against the opposite waves into the main sea. For the shore was so rocky, and had so many of the enemy upon it, that they were afraid to come to land. Nor was there any place whither they could fly, nor any way to save themselves, while they were thrust out of the sea by the violence of the wind, if they stayed where they were, and out of the city by the violence of the Romans. And much lamentation there was when the ships were dashed against one another, and a terrible noise when they were broken to pieces, and some of the multitude that were in them were covered with waves, and so perished. Some of them thought that to die by their own swords was lighter than by the sea, and so they killed themselves before they were drowned, although the greatest part of them were carried by the waves and dashed to pieces against the abrupt parts of the rocks, insomuch that the sea was bloody a long way, and the maritime parts were full of dead bodies. For the Romans came upon those that were carried to the shore and destroyed them, and the number of the bodies that were thus thrown out of the sea was 4,200. The Romans also took the city without opposition and utterly demolished it. Brethren, while this is not up in Galilee, it is a part of Vespasian's forces upon the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, where the Jews foolishly and fatally thought that they would have an advantage out on the water. And don't you know, providentially at that very moment comes the great and black north wind. And it's all over for the Jews. The second angel sounded, something like a great mountain burning with fire thrown in the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the creatures in the sea and had life died. A third of the ships were destroyed. There will be more naval battles. They will be on the Sea of Galilee. We'll have occasion to talk about them later in the book of Revelation, because that's later in Vespasian's campaign. We'll get to that in due time. Tonight, we come now to verses 10 and 11 in chapter 8. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of the waters. The star is named Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the waters because they were made bitter. Now, brother, we have an interesting kind of a conundrum that goes on right here due to the fact that in this case, we've actually got two very probable, very possible explanations or fulfillments that would be very similar again, that the sign might represent the reality. So the sign is not the reality, but it points to the reality. There'll be similarities, so not identical. And so it's just a matter of learning how to interpret prophetic language, which I hope in several other lessons of the introductory lessons I've tried to show you how to do from the Old Testament prophets. This third angel sounds in a great star. So there's a single star and a magnificently prodigious star, a great star, falls from heaven, burning like a torch, and fell on a third of the rivers and springs of waters named Wormwood. The third of the waters became wormwood. Many people died from the waters because they were made bitter. Now, my choice of the two possibilities is that this is typical in warfare, particularly ancient warfare, but even modern, that surface waters particularly, but very often wells, very intentionally by the enemy, are poisoned, either by the presence, the massive presence of so many dead bodies decaying, unburied for weeks and months. And so I think it just has to do as a symbol of furthering warfare, and again, maybe involving Galilee, where we have many people dying and made bitter, a third of the rivers and springs, so perhaps in Galilee only, but it could be distributed throughout all of Israel. This sounds to me like that it just is the poisoning of the waters to prevent the locals from having water, and or they're just fouled because of warfare itself. But, it's tempting to go the route, and I think it's also justifiable, that Art Ogden takes, that since the star is named Wormwood, and since it is an individual star, and particularly because of the usage of stars in both the Old Testament and the New, which might give Art's view a stronger case than mine, as a matter of fact. He is taking the view that this star is used as it is in the Old Testament and the New, and even to this day, we have Hollywood stars, for instance, of noteworthy, notable, influential, powerful, perhaps wealthy people. So a star to this day is somebody that is renowned for their influence, a star politician, a star musician, a star actor, a star businessman or whatever. And then he takes it that this may be, and he's, shows some hesitancy when you listen to his recordings or read the book, that this star would be Josephus himself. I think Art's got a good case. So whichever way you look at it, both of these took place in the course of the war. And I want to read now, since the fouling of waters would be easily understood, I'd like to read now some more excerpts from Josephus in Book 3, Chapter 9, paragraphs 5 and 6, which is just a small portion of the information Josephus gives of himself in the course of his being a general up in Galilee. But in Wars 3, 9, 5, and 6, it reads like this. When the fate of Jotapata was related at Jerusalem, it was reported that Josephus, he's writing of himself, was slain at the taking of the city, which piece of news filled Jerusalem full of sorrow. In every house also, and among all to whom any of the slain were allied, there was a lamentation. But the mourning for the commander was a public one, and some mourned for those that had lived with them, others for their kindred, others for their friends, and others for their brethren, but all mourned for Josephus, insomuch that the lamentation did not cease in the city before the 30th day. And a great many hired mourners with their pipes, who should begin the melancholy ditties for them. But as the truth came out in time, it was found that the death of Josephus was a fiction. And when they understood that he was alive and was among the Romans, and that the commanders treated him at another rate than they treated the captives, they were as vehemently angry at him now as they had showed their goodwill before, when he appeared to have been dead. He was also abused by some as having been a coward, and by others as a deserter. The city was full of indignation at him, and of reproaches cast upon him. Now listen to this. Their rage was also aggravated by their afflictions, and more inflamed by their ill success, and became a spur to them to venture on further calamities. They therefore resolved to fall on the Romans the more vehemently, as resolving to be revenged on him in revenging themselves on the Romans. End quote. Now, brother, what that is saying is that Josephus was their star general up in Galilee. He failed a couple of times, captured, defected, and unlike sea captains, but as soldiers ought to do in the minds of the Jews, he didn't go down with a ship. He didn't die in the fighting. He lived. And those that were taken prisoners as slaves were treated miserably. Josephus is feasting on Vespasian's table. And so when the word gets out that he had become a turncoat like this, they were embittered. And then, out of their bitterness, motivated to try to fight even harder, which resulted in nothing more than further calamities, more of their own bloodshed. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. Fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters, and the name of the star is called Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. Well, take your pick between these two possibilities. The passage in Revelation is fulfilled in literal physical events, in this case, two different ways with good probability. And we should be afraid of finding physical fulfillments altogether? We could find more than one? I think not. So I lean toward the befouling of the waters, and you may think this Josephus interpretation stronger. Well, be my guest then. What I know is that this book, Revelation, is about the fall of Jerusalem, ultimately, and the temple's destruction, as foretold so often in the Old and New Testaments. This I know with growing certainty. As every chapter unfolds, it becomes more and more until, for me, it is undeniably, unarguably true that Revelation can't be teaching anything else. It's just simply not possible. So as I maintained in one of the early lessons about the date, brethren, it is backwards to first decide from uninspired literature when Revelation was written, and then decide to take Jerusalem, which all Scripture declares is the only possible city that can be discussed, off the table, as possible, in favor of inventing these nebulous, that might be this, it could be that, we think that, and, perhapses. I remember taking previously several classes from renowned and very capable teachers, and among churches of Christ, so my brethren and mostly yours, and just sitting there thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense. I'm more confused than I was when I started. I don't understand why there's any justification for these ideas that this teacher's floating there. I remember the first time I studied, the book that the teacher had chosen was William Hendrickson's More Than Conquerors. And it was supposed to be a high-level study for preacher trainees. And when I got done with that study as a 3-year-old Christian, that's all the time I had under my belt. I remember being just very strongly impressed that my teacher didn't know what he was talking about, and Hendrickson certainly didn't either. But I was pretty sure that Revelation was not about what they'd been saying. I didn't know what it was about. Hadn't read Josephus yet. Didn't understand the Old Testament prophets very well. I was only 3 years old. But at that time, I could still tell they did not know what they were talking about. I think Josephus did. He knew what he was talking about because he was an eyewitness. He did not know that he was talking about what Jesus said would happen in that generation, when all the blood would be held against those Jews. And so, as I look at this, I see literal physical fulfillments, because the literal physical fulfillments are so close to the symbolic imagery. Now we'll close tonight with Revelation 8, 12 and 13. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun. And we keep getting these thirds, and I just think, brethren, it's the early months of the 3.5 years, the 1,260 days, the 42 months, which all those expressions happen to be equivalent. The fourth angel sounded, and in the third of the sun, we're talking about Vespasian's earlier work in the midst of that 3.5 years. A third of the sun, a third of the moon, a third of the stars were struck. And again, I think people there is a way it's used in the Old Testament, so you decide, that a third of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. And I looked, and I heard an eagle. Some translations or manuscripts have angel. Doesn't make any difference which way you go. Flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to those who live on the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound." So, fourth of the seven angels. We're in chapter 8, the first chapter that is what all the scrolls of Revelation is about. The seventh seal is opened. Out come these angels to unfold the plan that's in the book. So what does the fourth angel represent? Now, in this case, brethren, I think what I'd like to do is just have you open the syllabus. I gave everybody either electronically or in print. The syllabus on page 36 is chapter 8, page 36. In this case, look on down at verses 12, right at the bottom there, and 13. Third of the sun, moon, and stars equals the fall of the Jewish leaders. And so once again, in concert with Art Ogden then, Josephus was certainly one of them, but we have leaders among the Jews being assassinated by other Jews. You got to read Wars of the Jews. It's just so mind-bogglingly fabulous to read this book. And so stars, literally, physically, I'm reading from my notes, have a root meaning, which is a celestial body. So the word stars is used in Genesis 1, 16, 15, 5, 22, 17, 26, 4, a host of others, in that manner. The word has a physical understanding in cosmology. But next line, it also starts with stars. Figurative or symbolic use in Scripture refers to ruling dignitaries. Now, I've got 1 minute to go. You've got all the passages. Do your homework. Study it yourself, as I've done year after year after year. So Isaiah 14, verses 3 and 4, and 12 and 13 use stars that way. Note, even at the creation, in Genesis 1, 16 through 18, literal physical stars were associated with governing the day and the night. Jesus is several times associated with a star in Numbers 24, 12 through 19, especially so I embolden it in Matthew 2, verses 1 through 10. Twice he's the morning star in Revelation. For the tape's sake, if you don't have this, is Revelation 2:28 and 22:16. And then I have consider a few examples. Well, they'll be convincing, I think. If you're a Bible student, you don't have to go read Irenaeus and decide that, Jerusalem's impossible first. You just go back and see in Ezekiel 32, 2 through 11, Daniel 8, 8 through 10, and in same chapter, 16 through 26, Daniel 12, 3, Matthew 24, 29, Revelation 1:20. In all these places, you have stars being used in a figurative or symbolic sense to represent real live human beings in the flesh breathing on the earth. So the symbol is a star. But we're not allowed to make anything we want out of it or deny that it even could have a physical fulfillment. When they are being used that way and we're told that way, the interpretation in these other passages is that they represent the powerful movers and shakers in a given time and place. So that's the last of the slides for tonight. And I just love this chapter, brethren, because here especially and suddenly, as the bulk of the scroll, not just the seals, they're almost inconsequential next to what's in the scroll that only Jesus can tell us about. He undoes the 7 seals, and they're impressive in and of themselves and foreboding, explanatory in the case of the 5th seal, that it's going to be all about the souls have been slain and they want vengeance for those first century killers, murderers, Jewish killers and murderers. And then a little while passes, the 144,000 are sealed, the great multitude is also clothed in white robes, and then the 7 seals open, the delay is over, and here we go. And then one symbol after another just looks so convincingly and persuasively in real life like what Josephus saw with his own eyes in the generation that Jesus was talking to in the temple in Matthew 23 on, of course, the Mount of Olives in Matthew 24 and everywhere else throughout the Gospel of Matthew and elsewhere. So I'll leave you with all of that, and I realize it's quite an overload. I realize that at first blush you go, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure, and Larry, you're going so fast. I understand that. You go as fast as you like. You read all of those passages. And I think I can tell you with some certainty now, and this is the 9th time I've taught this class, the majority, and I think the great majority of those who take my classes are convinced that we're on the right train. And even if I get a car in that train wrong once in a while, and so I walk into that particular car on the train, and I look at all the decorations and then I understand them incorrectly. Well, okay, but that doesn't change the fact that the train is still moving down the same rail. And I know I've got work to do with some of these symbols. But brethren, I don't think I've got much work to do with all of them. So you just keep working the problem too. And I believe that after I was convinced 33 years ago, I've been nothing but more firmly convinced in all the remaining years or subsequent years. I believe you will be too. Trust your prophets. They will be fulfilled. And in this case, they were, in the time frame they gave, events that were shortly to come to pass when the book of Revelation was written. See you next week. I truly hope. Have a good night.